The clock on the microwave read 6:42 a.m. when the sound started. It was not the gentle bird song of a late spring morning, nor the distant hum of the first commuters on the county road. It was a rhythmic, percussive scraping, the sound of a flat-nosed shovel striking clay and rock over and over. I was standing at my kitchen sink, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its gurgling cycle, a ritual unchanged for the 40 years I had lived in this house. From my window, past the azaleas my wife Eleanor had planted, I could see them. Two men in muddy boots and fluorescent yellow vests, digging a trench across the swale at the edge of my property line. And standing beside them, arms crossed, pointing, was Brenda Miller, president of the Northwood Pines Homeowners Association. I poured the coffee into a heavy ceramic mug, the one Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary, and walked out onto my back porch. The air was cool and damp. The men stopped digging when they saw me, leaning on their shovels and looking expectantly at Brenda. She, however, did not stop her pantomime of authority. She jabbed a finger toward my house, then swept it along the path of their trench, a shallow but determined scar in the green turf. The trench was designed with crude but effective geometry to do one thing: divert the storm runoff from the common area directly toward the foundation of my house, specifically toward the basement window wells. I took a slow sip of coffee. It was hot, black, and bitter, just right. I did not say a word. I simply stood there on my porch, about 50 feet away, and watched. Brenda finally seemed to realize that her audience of two workmen was not the one she needed to convince. She straightened up, puffed out her chest in that way she had, a gesture meant to convey unshakable authority, and marched toward me. She stopped at the invisible line where my manicured lawn met the slightly wilder grass of the HOA common area. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice carrying the sharp, self-assured tone of someone who has never been successfully contradicted. "As you can see, the association is finally correcting the drainage issue caused by your improper landscaping. This runoff has been pooling in the common area for years. We're simply redirecting it to the main storm drain. I knew for a fact there was no main storm drain on that side of my property. The original subdivision plan, which I still had a copy of in my study, directed all runoff from that slope into the swale, which then carried it safely around the houses and into a retention pond a quarter-mile down the road. Her correction was a violation of county code, the HOA's own governing documents, and about a dozen principles of basic civil engineering." I took another sip of coffee. "Brenda," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the still morning air, "those men are on my property. The survey stake is another 10 feet that way." I gestured with my mug toward a small, orange-flagged metal pin, nearly hidden by a clump of daylilies. "You are digging on my land, and you are creating a nuisance that will cause material damage to my home. I am asking you to stop, fill in the trench, and have your men leave." She laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a short, sharp bark of derision. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. This is association property. Everyone knows the line is at your flower beds. It's been that way for 30 years. Historic use." She turned to the workmen. "Keep digging. We need to have this done before the rain starts this afternoon." She then turned back to me, her expression hardening into a mask of practiced intimidation. "And I'll have you know, I am acting with the full authority of the board. If you interfere, I will call the sheriff. I will have you cited for harassment. The association will levy a fine for every day you obstruct this necessary maintenance. We will place a lien on your house, Arthur. We will own it." I just looked at her. I looked at the determined set of her jaw, the absolute conviction in her eyes. She genuinely believed every word she was saying. She believed her feelings about where the property line should be were more real than the surveyed, recorded, and legally binding plat map filed with the county clerk. She believed her title of HOA president gave her the power to commandeer private property and redirect water flows based on a whim. She believed that threatening an old man with fines and liens was the same as being right. I finished my coffee and set the empty mug down on the porch railing. The workmen had resumed their digging, the shovels biting into my lawn, tossing clumps of grass and soil onto a growing pile. I pulled out my phone and began recording. I didn't say another word to her. I just filmed the men, the trench, and Brenda standing there, arms crossed again, a little Napoleon surveying her conquest. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet widower who kept to himself, a retired old man who paid his HOA dues on time and never came to meetings. She had no idea that for 35 years, I was the chief engineer, and later the appointed director of the Northwood County Water Management District. She had no idea that the swale she was destroying was not just a low spot in the grass, but a registered tertiary drainage easement under the district's jurisdiction. She had no idea that I had personally designed it. And she certainly had no idea that by digging that trench, she wasn't just threatening to flood my basement. She was declaring war on the very entity that controlled every drop of water in the entire county. She had no idea she had just handed me the shovel to dig her own grave. But before I tell you what I did, I should probably explain how things got to this point. It didn't start with a trench. It never does. It starts with small things, with tiny erosions of reason and process, until one day you wake up and there are men with shovels trying to flood your basement. My wife Eleanor and I bought this house in 1978. It was one of the first in the subdivision. We loved the quiet, the space between the lots, and the view of the woods out back. For most of our lives here, the homeowners association was a formality. It was a volunteer group of neighbors who collected $100 a year to mow the common areas and maintain the little wooden sign at the entrance. The meetings were held once a year in someone's living room, over coffee and cake. We discussed planting flowers, organizing a neighborhood watch, and planning the annual summer picnic. It was communal. It was reasonable. Eleanor passed away 6 years ago. The house became quieter, larger. My world shrank to my work, my garden, and my memories. I retired 2 years after that. I had spent my entire career in water. I started as a junior engineer, surveying creeks and culverts. I ended up running the whole show. The Northwood County Water Management District wasn't just a utility. It was a special-purpose governmental entity created by state statute. We had the power of eminent domain. We had our own legal counsel, our own enforcement division. We managed every reservoir, every aquifer, every storm drain, every drainage easement in a 500-square-mile area. When a developer wanted to build a new subdivision like Northwood Pines, they had to come to us first. Their plans for drainage, runoff, and water supply had to be submitted, reviewed, and approved by my engineers. I had personally signed off on the final plat for this very neighborhood back in the late 70s. My signature was on the original vellum, stored in the county archives. On paper, my authority over that swale was absolute. Brenda Miller and her husband moved in about 4 years ago. They bought the old Henderson place 2 doors down. From the start, she seemed to view the neighborhood not as a community, but as a kingdom in disarray, waiting for a firm hand. She was a real estate agent, and she carried herself with the aggressive, superficial charm of someone who is always closing a deal. She saw our quiet, informal HOA as an untapped source of power. Within a year, she had gotten herself elected to the board. A year after that, she was president. The change was immediate. The annual dues tripled. The friendly newsletters were replaced by slick, professionally printed booklets filled with new rules and regulations. Suddenly, the color you could paint your front door was restricted. The type of flowers you could plant was subject to approval by an architectural review committee, which consisted of Brenda and a woman named Carol, who always agreed with her. Fines started appearing. $10 for leaving your garbage can out an hour too long. $50 for a crack in your driveway. $100 for having a garden gnome she deemed tacky. Most of my neighbors were like me. They were older, retired, on fixed incomes. They valued peace. They grumbled, but they paid the fines. It was easier than fighting. It was easier than going to the contentious monthly meetings, which Brenda ran like a tribunal. She would sit at a folding table, flanked by her board, and publicly admonish residents for their supposed violations. It was pure performance. She thrived on the drama, the confrontation, the exercise of her petty power. I watched from a distance. I paid my dues. I even paid a $50 fine once for having a small patch of clover in my lawn, which she deemed a noxious weed. I didn't argue, I just sent a check. And I kept the violation notice, and the carbon copy of the check, and the envelope it was mailed in. I put them in a simple manila folder. The folder was labeled HOA. The issue with the swale began about a year ago. We had a particularly rainy spring. The common area behind my house, which is at a slightly lower elevation, became soggy. It was supposed to. That was its job. It was a vegetated basin designed to hold water and let it percolate slowly into the ground, with the swale handling the overflow. Brenda, who had no understanding of hydrology, declared it a swamp. She said it was a breeding ground for mosquitoes and was lowering property values. Her first move was to hire a landscaping company to dump several truckloads of topsoil into the basin, effectively destroying its water retention capacity. She did this without a permit, without consulting an engineer, and without a vote of the homeowners. She just did it. The result was predictable. The next time it rained, the water, with nowhere else to go, sheeted across the now raised common area and pooled in the swale right at my property line. She then declared the swale itself to be the problem. She began sending me notices. "Your drainage ditch is flooding the common area," one read. It wasn't my ditch. It was a shared utility easement, clearly marked on the subdivision plat. She demanded that I, at my own expense, regrade the entire ditch to properly channel water away from association property. It was a complete inversion of reality. Her illegal landfilling project had created the problem, and now she was demanding I provide the solution. I kept the notices, every single one. I photographed the soggy common area after her landscaping. I photographed the swale doing its job perfectly before her interference. I printed out the relevant sections of the County Land Development Code. I printed a copy of the original drainage plan for the subdivision. The HOA folder grew thicker. On paper, my case was ironclad, but I knew that presenting facts to Brenda was like trying to explain calculus to a cat. She was not interested in facts. She was interested in narrative, and in her narrative, she was the righteous protector of the community, and I was the stubborn old man causing all the problems. I held back, hoping she would simply move on to some other crusade. That was my mistake. I underestimated her obsession. For her, this was no longer about a soggy lawn. It was about power. It was about bending me to her will. Her failure to intimidate me with letters had become a personal affront. She had to escalate. She had to make a public show of her authority, which brings us back to that morning, with the shovels and the trench, and the absurd, baseless threats. She thought she was writing the final chapter of her little drama. She had no idea she was just providing me with the perfect, video-documented opening scene for my own story. A story that would be told not with angry words at a board meeting, but with evidence, with statutes, and with the full, crushing weight of a process she could not comprehend. I kept the receipts, all of them, and her little trench was about to become the most expensive ditch she had ever imagined. After I finished recording, I went back inside. I uploaded the video file from my phone to a secure cloud server and also saved a copy to a dedicated hard drive. I labeled the file with the date and time. May 17th, 2023, 06:55. The methodical nature of the task was calming. This was my world. Data, documentation, preservation of fact. While Brenda operated in a world of emotion, assertion, and social pressure, I was preparing to meet her on a different field of battle entirely. A field made of paper. My first step was not to call the sheriff myself, or to run outside and yell at the workmen. That would be playing her game. My game was quieter, more deliberate. I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It was simple, direct, and legally precise. It identified the property by its parcel number. It cited the recorded plat map, book, and page number, showing the property lines and the drainage easement. It stated that her agents were trespassing and causing willful damage to private property. It demanded that all work stop immediately, the trench be refilled, and the turf restored. It concluded by stating that failure to comply by noon that day would result in further legal action, for which she and the HOA would be held liable for all costs and damages. I printed 2 copies. I walked out my front door, got in my car, and drove to the post office. I sent 1 copy, via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's official address, which was a post office box Brenda had set up. This created an unimpeachable record of delivery. The second copy I intended to deliver by hand. I drove back and parked in my driveway. Brenda was still there, preening over the progress of her trench. It was nearly complete now. A muddy gash running from the common area and ending just a few feet from my basement window well. I walked over, holding the letter. I did not raise my voice. "Brenda," I said, holding it out to her, "this is a formal notice. I suggest you read it." She looked at the envelope, then at me, a smirk playing on her lips. She took it from my hand, tore it open, and glanced at the single page. Her eyes scanned it for a few seconds. The smirk vanished. She crumpled the letter into a ball in her fist. "Your threats are pathetic, Arthur," she spat, throwing the wadded-up paper onto the ground at my feet. "This is happening, you can't stop it." She turned to the workmen. "You're done here. Get your tools, the rain will do the rest." She had just made another critical mistake. Her public contemptuous dismissal of a formal warning was a gift. I picked up the crumpled ball of paper, smoothed it out as best I could, and placed it carefully in my pocket. It was evidence. Her performance of dominance was, in reality, a confession of bad faith. I went back to my desk and got to work. For the rest of the day, I did not leave my study. I had a small cot in there for late nights at the district, so I decided to stay there, away from the rest of the house. It was a tactical retreat. I needed to focus. I called my replacement at the water district, a sharp young engineer named David, whom I had mentored for years. I didn't tell him the whole story, not yet. I just asked him for a favor. "David," I said, "could you have someone pull the full file for the Northwood Pines subdivision? I want everything. The original engineering reports, the soil percolation tests, the correspondence with the developer, the final signed plats, and especially the easement dedication documents." He was quiet for a moment. "Is everything all right, Arthur?" "Everything's fine, David. Just working on a little historical project. Call it a retirement hobby." He promised to have a courier deliver the file to my house the next morning. Next, I called my lawyer, not just any lawyer, but Marcus Thorne, the chief legal counsel for the water district. Marcus was a bulldog who lived and breathed administrative and property law. We had worked together for 2 decades, fighting developers, other municipalities, even the state government on occasion. We had never lost a significant case. "Marcus," I said, after explaining the situation in calm, measured tones, "she's knowingly diverting storm runoff onto my property in direct violation of the recorded plat and a dedicated easement." I could almost hear him smile through the phone. "Arthur, my friend, this is not a problem. This is a gift. Did you get it on video?" "Of course." "Did you send a certified letter?" "This morning." And her response. She crumpled it up and threw it on the ground. Marcus laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Oh, this is beautiful. It's a textbook case. Willful destruction of property, violation of a recorded easement, creating a private and public nuisance. The fines alone will be biblical. Arthur, just sit tight. Let her finish. Let the damage happen. It only makes our case stronger. Document everything. While I waited for the files and for the inevitable rain, I began to assemble my own file. I pulled out the thick HOA folder. I began to build a timeline, a meticulous, cross-referenced history of Brenda's tenure. Every threatening letter, every baseless fine, every angry email she had sent to me, and, I suspected, to others. I scanned every document. I created a spreadsheet. Each row was an action, with columns for date, description, supporting document, and the specific bylaw or county code it violated. On paper, the pattern was damning. It showed a clear escalation, a campaign of harassment, culminating in the physical alteration of my property. Late that afternoon, the sky grew dark. The rain started, a gentle patter at first, then a steady, determined downpour. I didn't go to the basement window. I didn't need to. I already knew what was happening. I could hear the sound of water, not in the gutters where it belonged, but gushing through the new trench, pouring against the side of my house. I just sat at my desk, listening to the rain and the quiet hum of my document scanner. It was during this methodical work, as I cross-referenced the HOA's bylaws with the original developer's covenants filed with the county, that I found it. The bombshell. It was a single paragraph in a dense 20-page document from 1977. A document I was certain no one in the HOA, least of all Brenda, had ever bothered to read in its entirety. It was Article 9, Section 4, Control of Drainage. It stated, in excruciatingly clear legalese, that whereas the Northwood County Water Management District had approved the subdivision's master drainage plan, any and all future alterations, modifications, or maintenance of any drainage easement, swale, or retention facility within Northwood Pines would be subject to the prior written approval of the district. It went on to say that in any dispute regarding drainage, the district's engineering determination would be final and binding upon the homeowners association. The developer had put that clause in to protect themselves from future liability. The county had likely required it as a condition of approval, and there it was, a dormant clause, a hidden weapon, waiting for 40 years. Brenda thought she was the ultimate authority in Northwood Pines. She had no idea that, on paper, when it came to the very ground she was digging up, her authority was precisely zero. The final word belonged to the Northwood County Water Management District. And I, for all intents and purposes, was the district. My quiet retirement hobby was about to become very interesting indeed. The next morning the courier from the district arrived. He delivered a heavy banker's box filled with files. It smelled of old paper and archives. It was a complete history of the birth of my neighborhood, told in blueprints, soil reports, and legal documents. It contained the original vellum plat map, a beautiful piece of draftsmanship, with my own signature in the approval block, faded but clear. It also contained a copy of the very same developer's covenants I had found online, but this one was the official, recorded version, stamped by the county clerk. My bombshell was confirmed. I spent the morning with a ruler and an engineering scale, cross-referencing the old plat map with a current satellite image of the neighborhood. The survey stake I had pointed out to Brenda was, as I knew, precisely on the property line. Her trench was entirely on my land. The easement for the swale was clearly delineated, a 20-foot wide corridor centered on the low point. Her actions were a flagrant encroachment. Around 11 a.m., my doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw two sheriff's deputies standing on my porch. A younger man and an older, more weathered officer. Brenda, of course, was standing on the sidewalk, pointing at my house and talking animatedly. The performance had begun. I took a deep breath, composed myself, and opened the door. The older deputy, whose name tag read Miller, no relation I hoped, spoke first. "Sir, are you Arthur Peterson?" "I am," I said calmly. "We've had a complaint from the HOA president, Ms. Miller," he said, gesturing with his thumb toward Brenda. "She says you've been harassing her and her contractors, and that you're refusing to allow necessary maintenance on community property." Brenda had clearly concocted a new narrative. In her version, I was now the aggressor. It was a bold move. I looked past the deputies at her. She had a look of triumphant righteousness on her face. She thought she had me cornered. She thought the arrival of men in uniforms would finally break me. "Officers," I said, my voice even. "That is not an accurate description of events. May I show you something?" I stepped back and gestured them into my entryway. I had a small table there, and on it I had laid out a single document. A clean, large-format copy of the official subdivision plat map. I had highlighted my property lot, the common area, and the drainage easement in different colors. It was simple, visual, and undeniable. "This is the recorded plat for this subdivision," I explained, pointing to the county clerk's stamp. "This yellow area is my property. This green area is HOA common land. The survey marker is located right here." My finger tapped the precise spot. "The trench Ms. Miller had dug yesterday is located entirely within my property here." I traced the line of the trench, which I had penciled in. "Furthermore, this blue-shaded area is a dedicated drainage easement under the jurisdiction of the County Water Management District. Any alteration of that easement requires a permit from the district. I can assure you no such permit was issued." The younger deputy, whose name was Evans, leaned in, studying the map. He was sharp. I could see the gears turning. "And you are?" he asked. "I'm the retired director of the Water Management District," I said simply. "I designed it." Deputy Miller's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He had been a cop for a long time. He knew the difference between a hysterical complaint and a documented fact. He understood jurisdiction. "I see," he said slowly. He turned and looked at Brenda, who was now shifting her weight on the sidewalk, her confidence beginning to waver as the deputies failed to immediately put me in handcuffs. "Before you go," I said, "I have a request. I would like to make a formal statement on the record. If you have a body camera, I would appreciate it if you would ensure it is activated." Deputy Evans tapped his chest. "It's been on since we arrived, sir." "Excellent." I looked directly at the camera on his chest. "My name is Arthur Peterson. I am the owner of this property, 124 Willow Creek Lane. Yesterday on May 17th, at approximately 6:45 a.m., Brenda Miller, president of the Northwood Pines HOA, directed 2 workmen to enter my property without my consent and excavate a trench for the purpose of diverting storm runoff onto my land and against the foundation of my home. I have video of this action. I verbally informed Ms. Miller that she was trespassing. I later provided her with a written cease and desist notice, which she destroyed in my presence. As a direct result of her actions, my basement has flooded, causing significant damage. I am formally accusing her of willful destruction of property, trespassing, and illegal alteration of a registered drainage easement. I finished, my voice never rising. I had not presented an argument. I had presented a set of facts, delivered directly into the official record. On paper, or in this case on video, my statement was now part of a police report. The deputies stood in silence for a moment. Then, Deputy Miller nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. We'll note that in our report." They walked back out to Brenda. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see the change in her body language. Her confident posture deflated. Her animated gestures ceased. She was being told, I imagine, that this was a civil matter. She was being told that the man she thought was a pushover had just presented a clear, documented case, and that her performance had been met with the cold, hard reality of a plat map. They spoke to her for about 5 minutes. She shook her head, tried to argue, but the deputies remained impassive. Finally, they got back in their patrol car and drove away. They did not give me a second glance. They did not need to. They had their report. Brenda stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at my front door. The look on her face was no longer one of triumph. It was something else. A mixture of confusion and fury. The rules of her game had just changed, and she didn't understand why. She had brought the authorities to my door, expecting them to be her muscle. Instead, they had become my stenographers. She had no idea how badly her plan had just backfired. That evening, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was my next-door neighbor, a quiet man named George Henderson. He was a retired accountant, a widower like myself, and one of the original homeowners. He was also one of Brenda's favorite targets. She had fined him relentlessly for the state of his paint, the oil stain on his driveway, and the fact that his old oak tree dropped leaves onto the common area. George was a gentle soul, and he had always just paid, not wanting to cause trouble. He was holding a small digital audio recorder in his hand. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard the deputies were here. I saw her face after they left." He took a deep breath. "I think you might be able to use this." He explained that after Brenda's last few tirades at the monthly HOA meetings, he had started recording the audio on his little device. He said she was so arrogant, so convinced of her own righteousness, that she would say the most outrageous things, openly admitting her disregard for the bylaws if they didn't suit her. "I was afraid to do anything with them," he confessed. "She's vindictive, but what you did, standing up to her, it was brave." He handed me the recorder. "The last meeting is on there," he said. "She talks about her plan for your swale, the whole thing. Someone asked if she'd gotten an engineer's report. She laughed at them. This was a breakthrough." George was the fearful ally, the conscience of the community. His recordings were a third-party objective record of Brenda's intent and her dismissal of due process. It was one thing for me to state she had acted in bad faith. It was another entirely to have her own voice captured on tape, proving it beyond any doubt. I thanked him profusely and promised him that I would handle it in a way that would protect him as much as possible. He just nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes, and shuffled back to his house. The next day, I received an anonymous email. It was short and to the point. "I am a member of the HOA board. I voted against the landscaping project, but Brenda pushed it through anyway, claiming it was routine maintenance that didn't require a full board vote. She is out of control. The attached file is a copy of the minutes from that meeting. They have been edited by her to reflect a unanimous vote. The original draft is also attached. If you are planning to take action, there are others who will support you." The disillusioned insider. I suspected it was a woman named Sarah, a younger homeowner who had seemed uncomfortable during the few meetings I had attended. The documents she sent were dynamite. They were proof of Brenda deliberately falsifying official records to create a paper trail that supported her narrative. She was not just a bully. She was committing fraud. My case was growing stronger by the hour. A coalition was beginning to form, drawn out of the shadows by a single act of resistance. My lawyer Marcus was ecstatic when I told him about these new developments. "Arthur, it's a classic pattern," he said. "The tyrant pushes and pushes, assuming everyone is too scared to push back. The moment one person stands firm, the whole rotten structure starts to tremble. We have her on property damage, easement violation, and now falsifying corporate records. This is no longer just a civil suit." I'm going to have a chat with a friend in the district attorney's office. We began to prepare our final strategy. We would not just sue for damages. We would seek a temporary restraining order to prevent any further action by the HOA on my property, followed by a permanent injunction. We would file a formal complaint with the state board that regulated homeowners associations. And we would present the evidence of fraud to the DA. But before we filed anything, Marcus had an idea. "The HOA's annual meeting is next week, isn't it?" he asked. "Let's give her the stage. Let her perform one last time." The day before the meeting, Brenda made her final, desperate move. A courier delivered a large, imposing envelope to my door. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA. It informed me that an emergency assessment of $10,000 had been levied against my property. The charges were listed: unauthorized alteration of community drainage facilities, $5,000. Costs for remediation of damaged common area, $3,500. And legal consultation fees, $1,500. It was a work of pure fiction, a document so divorced from reality it was almost comical. She was charging me for the damage she had caused. She was billing me for the cost of the workmen she had hired to trespass on my land. It was her last wild escalation, an attempt to crush me under a mountain of fabricated debt before the annual meeting. She had no idea that this letter was the capstone of our case. It was a tangible, undeniable piece of evidence demonstrating financial malfeasance and retaliatory action. It was the final nail. I scanned it, emailed it to Marcus, and filed the original in my now bulging folder. The paper trail was complete. All that was left was the public reckoning. The community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen so many people at an annual HOA meeting. Word had clearly gotten around that something was going to happen. The air was thick with tension. Brenda's supporters, a small clique of homeowners who enjoyed the drama and her iron-fisted rule, were seated in the front rows, looking smug. Most of the room, however, consisted of my neighbors, the quiet ones, the ones who had been fined and intimidated for years. They sat with expressions of nervous anticipation. George Henderson was in the back, giving me a small, encouraging nod. I was seated next to Marcus Thorne, who had a single, impeccably organized three-ring binder on the table in front of him. The meeting began with routine business, but everyone knew what the main event was. Brenda, seated at the head table with her board, finally reached the agenda item labeled Special Assessment, 124 Willow Creek Lane. This was her moment. She stood up and walked to the podium, shuffling some papers. She began to speak, her voice trembling. With practiced emotion, she was performing the role of the beleaguered public servant, forced to take drastic action against a rogue homeowner. "My dear friends and neighbors," she began, her voice catching, "it is with a heavy heart that I must address a serious issue. For months our association has been dealing with a significant drainage problem, a swampy mess that has been a blight on our beautiful community and a danger to our children." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We have tried, politely and repeatedly, to work with the homeowner responsible, Mr. Arthur Peterson, to resolve the issue. We have been met with nothing but hostility and refusal," she went on, painting a picture of me as a stubborn, selfish old man, a recluse who cared nothing for his neighbors or the value of their homes. She claimed I had illegally altered the drainage on my property years ago to benefit myself. She held up a copy of the $10,000 assessment. "The board has been forced reluctantly to take this action, to hire contractors to fix the problem Mr. Peterson created, and to hold him financially responsible. We cannot allow one person's selfishness to harm our entire community." She dabbed at her eye with a tissue. "I know this is difficult, but I am asking for your support. For a vote to ratify this assessment, and place a lien on the property if it is not paid." It was a masterful performance of victimhood and righteous indignation. Her supporters murmured in sympathy. I simply sat there, my expression neutral, and watched her weave her fiction. When she was done, she looked directly at me, a challenge in her eyes. "Mr. Peterson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" I did not stand. I simply leaned toward the microphone on the table. "I do not," I said, "but my legal counsel does." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Brenda's confident expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She had not expected me to bring a lawyer. Marcus Thorne stood up. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of calm, lethal competence. He did not go to the podium. He simply stood by our table. "Good evening," he said, his voice filling the room without effort. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am here representing Mr. Peterson. I am also the chief counsel for the Northwood County Water Management District. The name of the district landed like a physical blow. You could feel the entire mood of the room shift. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. A governmental authority had entered the room. We will not be engaging in a debate this evening. Marcus continued, his tone matter of fact. We are here to present a set of undisputed facts. I have provided a copy of this binder to each member of the board. He gestured to the identical binders his assistant was now placing in front of Brenda and the other board members. I invite the rest of you to follow along. He opened his binder. Fact 1. The land in question is the private property of Mr. Peterson. Tab A is a certified copy of the county plat map, cross-referenced with a recent survey. The trench excavated at Ms. Miller's direction constitutes trespassing and property damage. He paused. Brenda stared at the plat map in her binder, her face pale. Fact 2. The swale on Mr. Peterson's property is a registered county drainage easement. Tab B contains the easement dedication documents. Any alteration of this easement without a permit from the water district is a violation of county code, subject to fines of up to $1,000 per day. The murmuring in the room grew louder. Fact 3. On May 17th, Ms. Miller was provided with a formal cease and desist notice, which she destroyed. Tab C is a photograph of the crumpled notice, along with a signed affidavit from the postal carrier, who will testify to its delivery, and a copy of the certified mail receipt. Fact 4. The sheriff's department was called to the scene. Ms. Miller alleged harassment by my client. After viewing the evidence, the deputies took a formal statement from Mr. Peterson, accusing Ms. Miller of property destruction. Tab D is a copy of the official police report, number 23-7461. Brenda's hands were trembling slightly. She was frozen, staring at the evidence of her own actions, laid out in cold, black and white. Fact 5, Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. Ms. Miller has claimed her actions were supported by the board. However, at Tab E, you will find the minutes from the April 11th board meeting. You will also find the original draft of those minutes, provided by a member of the board. The original shows the motion to proceed with the work was defeated. The official minutes have been altered to reflect a unanimous approval. This is a fraudulent document. A gasp went through the room. Sarah, the board member, looked down at her lap, but a small, determined smile touched her lips. Fact 6. Marcus raised his voice slightly. Ms. Miller has repeatedly claimed her sole motivation was to address a drainage problem. At Tab F, you will find a transcript of an audio recording from the May 9th HOA meeting, during which Ms. Miller states, and I quote, "I don't care what the engineers say. I am tired of that old man's attitude, and I'm going to teach him a lesson about who runs this neighborhood." The recording itself will be provided to law enforcement. George Henderson sank a little lower in his seat in the back, but he was beaming. Marcus let the weight of that quote settle in the room. The silence was absolute. Brenda's face had gone from pale to a mottled, waxy gray. The mask was gone. There was no performance left. There was only the blank, stunned expression of someone who has been so thoroughly, so methodically dismantled that they can no longer process what is happening. This was the moment of her collapse. She had walked into the room a queen, and she was being revealed, page by page, as a common criminal. Then Marcus delivered the final, killing blow. Finally, he said, turning a page, the board, and Ms. Miller in particular, appear to be operating under the misapprehension that they have any authority whatsoever over this matter. At Tab G, you will find a copy of the original developer's covenants for Northwood Pines, recorded in 1977. I direct your attention to Article 9, Section 4, which states that all matters related to drainage are under the final and binding authority of the Northwood County Water Management District. He closed the binder with a soft, final thud. Mr. Arthur Peterson retired as the director of that district. For 35 years he was the final authority. This HOA has no jurisdiction here. The assessment is invalid. The actions taken were illegal, and the individuals responsible will be held accountable. He sat down. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every eye in the room was on Brenda Miller. She stood, speechless, behind the podium, her fantasy kingdom of rules and fines and power having evaporated around her in the space of 5 minutes. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at her fellow board members, but they refused to meet her gaze, instead staring intently at the damning evidence in their binders. The performance was over. There was nothing left but the ugly, documented truth. The immediate aftermath was swift and decisive. An elderly gentleman in the back of the room, Mr. Abernathy, who had lived here even longer than I had, stood up and cleared his throat. "Madam President," he said, his voice quavering but firm, "in light of this information, I move for an immediate vote of no confidence and the removal of Brenda Miller from the board of directors, effective immediately." Sarah, the disillusioned insider, immediately seconded the motion. A vote was called. It was nearly unanimous. Brenda was stripped of her title and her power right there, in front of the entire community she had lorded over. She didn't say a word. She gathered her purse and walked out of the clubhouse, her face a blank mask of shock. The meeting continued. A new temporary board was elected, with Sarah at its head. Their first official act was to unanimously vote to rescind the $10,000 assessment against me and issue a formal apology. Their second act was to schedule a full audit of the HOA's financials under Brenda's tenure, but the public humiliation was only the beginning of her consequences. The following week, Marcus, acting on behalf of the Water District, filed a lawsuit against the HOA and against Brenda Miller personally. The suit was for the cost of professionally remediating the damage to the county easement, plus daily fines retroactive to the day the trench was dug. The district's authority under the covenants was ironclad. There was no defense. The HOA's insurance carrier, upon reviewing the evidence of Brenda's willful and fraudulent actions, denied the claim, leaving her and the HOA to face the financial penalty alone. Simultaneously, Marcus presented our entire file to the district attorney. The combination of falsifying corporate records, the retaliatory and baseless special assessment, and the audio recording of her stated intent to teach him a lesson was more than enough. The DA's office brought charges against her for felony fraud. Faced with the mountain of evidence, she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, receiving 2 years of probation, a hefty fine, and an order to pay full restitution for the damages to my basement. The cost of her little trench, including legal fees, fines, and the restitution, ultimately exceeded $50,000. The community began to heal. The new HOA board, led by Sarah, was a breath of fresh air. They went through the bylaws with a fine-toothed comb, eliminating all of Brenda's petty vindictive rules. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded. The fines for trivial matters were abolished. The annual dues were lowered. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. People started talking to each other again. The fear was gone. George Henderson started planting a small vegetable garden in his front yard, something Brenda had explicitly forbidden. Others followed suit. The neighborhood started to feel like a community again, not a gulag of beige siding and approved flower arrangements. Brenda and her husband put their house up for sale less than a month after the meeting. It sold quickly. I never saw her again. The house was bought by a young family with 2 small children. Their laughter now drifts over the fence on summer evenings, a welcome sound in the quiet. My basement was repaired, paid for in full by Brenda's restitution check. The swale was professionally restored by a crew from the Water District, its gentle slope and native grasses once again ready to manage the rain as intended. The scar from her trench vanished, replaced by fresh green sod. It was as if it had never happened. But I kept the folder. I didn't destroy it. It sits on a shelf in my study, a heavy, tangible reminder. A reminder that reason and process, while slow and quiet, are ultimately more powerful than noise and fury. A reminder that truth exists on paper, in recorded deeds, and signed documents, and that it will, with patience, eventually overcome the most convincing of performances. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit on my back porch with a cup of tea, looking out over the swale. It's just a grassy depression, unremarkable to the casual eye, but to me it's a symbol. It represents a kind of quiet order. It does its job without fanfare, using the simple, immutable laws of gravity and hydrology to protect the homes around it. It works because it was designed with care, with foresight, and with respect for the rules of nature. Eleanor would have liked that. She was never one for confrontation, but she had a fierce, quiet belief in doing things the right way. She would have hated what Brenda tried to do, not just to our home, but to the spirit of our community. And I think she would have been proud of how it was resolved. Not with shouting, but with documentation. Not with anger, but with a well-organized binder. A few weeks ago I took the original plat map, the one with my signature on it, to a frame shop. It now hangs on the wall of my study, opposite my desk. It is a beautiful thing, a work of art and engineering. It is a map not just of property lines and easements, but of a promise. A promise that, if we agree on a set of rules and write them down, if we respect the lines in the process, we can live together in peace. It is a promise that was threatened, but ultimately, a promise that was kept. The house is quiet again, but it is a good quiet. A peaceful quiet. It is the sound of order restored.